Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined as always by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds, but not as always. No. For week 9, we are going to be doing something different with today's show. Monday, we focused a lot more on previewing the action for week 9. Today, we're going to dive right into Ryan's record predictions that he posted on the33rdteam.com. Help out some futures bettors, just help people out in general, understanding how the playoff picture might look for certain teams. And before we get into that, we are going to help you prep for the fantasy football playoffs. We're going to be talking about players to trade away, to trade for, quarterbacks to stream, defenses to stream, and other matchups to be aware of. This is something that Ryan's done for several years now, and I think he kind of does it at the highest level of anyone that's out there. So I was honored when he let me collaborate with some of that content, and I think we've got a pretty good show for you. So Ryan, before we dive into some of the specifics with quarterbacks, etc., why don't you just give us a little overview on why you actually care about schedule look-aheads and why the people out there, if they don't, should start?
I treat betting and fantasy as kind of different sides of the same coin, where if you can look ahead in the schedule and find soft matchups, like say in an awards market, say Patrick Mahomes in the MVP market. Let's say in the next 4 weeks he plays, the Panthers, the Bears, two other weak pass defenses. It's in your best interest to bet on him now in that scenario before he pops off and say he gets three spike games out of those 4 weeks. Just good to be aware of those situations in sports betting. Same with win totals. If a team goes on a difficult schedule run, maybe you want to bet they're under now. And the same thing's true in fantasy football, Josh. Best ball players know this. Week 15, 16, 17 are more important than week 2, especially week 17. So I think treating your season-long leagues the same way, where if you're in a good position, say you're 7-1 right now, maybe swap a quarterback that has a better playoff schedule.
Let's talk about the elite quarterbacks and their schedules. Let's start with Patrick Mahomes. Weeks 15, 16, 17, he's at New England for Monday Night Football, against the Raiders at home, and then against the Bengals at home. Any thoughts here on the most consistent quarterback in the NFL and potentially in fantasy as well?
Yeah, that's the name of the game, stability. Matchups don't matter as much with Patrick Mahomes as they do with anyone else. Not crazy about the New England matchup. I think you could absolutely blow up the Raiders, and obviously the Bengals have enormous upside from a scoring perspective.
Let's talk about Josh Allen. Weeks 15 through 17, he's at home against Dallas, at the Chargers. That's actually a Saturday game. And then at home against the Patriots.
You're not crazy about the matchup with Dallas just because of the pass rush. That could potentially, that adds some volatility to that game. That said, with Trayvon Diggs out, the secondary is a little reduced, so Allen's upside is huge there. Love the Chargers game. That's a wonderful game, probably the best game in week 16 to target. And then against the Patriots, the Bills lost to the Patriots. My only concern there is weather in Buffalo in late December is concerning, and there's some downside to that. Especially we already saw a couple years ago 30-mile-an-hour winds where the Patriots threw the ball 3 times in a game. So that's my concern there.
Yeah, I think there's some concern there. I think the positive, though, is that if there's any quarterback that's been able to actually succeed himself in some of these weather games, it's been the strong-armed Josh Allen. Let's hit up Jalen Hurts. He's on the road in Seattle. Then Monday Night Football, or actually a Monday game against the Giants at home, and then at home once again in week 17 against the Cardinals.
Yeah, he has smash spots in week 16 and 17 against the Giants and Cardinals. Only concern there really is, and we know this from Joe Banner, Philly looks to throw early so they can run late. If the Giants or Cardinals don't challenge them at all, that could be the case. Passing volume could be down. Seattle game's interesting. That has some shootout potential from both sides.
I actually really like that Cardinals game. Since the Cardinals have been a little better than expected, they're going to have Kyler Murray back. It's already been the 7th best matchup for fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and I think that could actually rise when Kyler Murray returns and teams are forced to throw more against the Cardinals. All right. This one's a little tough. Tua Tagovailoa, the Dolphins, historic offense, but weeks 15 through 17 are a murderer's row. They host the Jets. Then they host the Cowboys. Then week 17, they're on the road against the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah, I want to come at this one from a couple angles, Josh. I think this one's important. Right now to date, Dolphins have smashed cupcakes and struggled against real defenses. That's not to say that their offense isn't for real. It is innovative, stack speed on purpose. That said, I want to see them, and we're going to get an opportunity this week in Germany against the Chiefs. I want to see them play well against a real defense. If you want to take that approach, week 11 against the Raiders is a game where they probably blow out the Raiders. If your trade deadline happens after that, that's a mark, I think, where we can wait to see what happens there and make a decision there. But versus the Jets and the Cowboys, I'm very concerned about the pass rush in both of those games. Baltimore doesn't really concern me. We've already seen those teams shoot out, but Tua's schedule's strong enough where I do like him less later than I do right now.
Yeah, the way I'm seeing it is that you don't have to trade away Tua in fantasy football, but you just have to be where the floor is a lot lower. For all these premium quarterbacks we're talking about, Tua seems like the only one where weeks 15 and 16, you could get a single-digit fantasy performance from him. The other quarterbacks on this list, significantly less likely. Let's talk about Justin Herbert, same draft class as Tua. Thursday Night Football at Las Vegas for week 15. Obviously, we love that. Then facing the Bills at home in week 16, and then on the road in Denver for week 17.
That week 16 matchup for the Bills, I like it more from Josh Allen's side than Herbert's, just because the defenses are better. But still, if that game went over 60 total points and, ended up, being decided by 3, no surprise there. At Denver, I'm not crazy about, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I think the best one for me right there is that they're at Las Vegas in week 15. You actually posted in our free Discord a win totals bet to take. At this point, we have hammered the under 6.5 wins for the Raiders.
Yeah,
it looks like a franchise that is going downhill for this season. We'll talk about them more later, though. So let's talk about something more positive. Lamar Jackson actually has a pretty interesting schedule. At Jacksonville for Sunday Night Football, then at the 49ers, and then against the Miami Dolphins at home. So we got Jacksonville, 49ers, Dolphins.
One of the things with Lamar is that isn't true for any of these other quarterbacks. You don't need him to shred anyone through the air. He can run for 80 yards and a touchdown or 2 and get you there. At Jacksonville is an excellent game. I believe they played last year, and this final score was 28-27. So definitely high scoring potential there. Hate the 49ers game. That's one where I don't think I'd bench Lamar Jackson really any scenario, but them and the Steelers are the 2 teams where I'd really consider it. Then Miami, Josh, if we're talking about range of outcomes here, over 70 points is legitimately on the table in that game. So I like Lamar, definitely like him in week 17.
Same here. And then Joe Burrow, who is surging in real football, starting to surge in fantasy. The calf looks fully healed up. He has a pretty fun schedule. Home against the Vikings, then on the road against the Steelers, and then on the road once again for the Chiefs in week 17.
As you know, Josh, we had Jamar Chase 1.01. One of the reasons was if Kirk Cousins was still healthy, that game against the Vikings had so much shootout potential. I think it's a little bit more one-sided now where you're looking for Burrow to stack production on them early, because that's probably going to be, the Bengals are probably going to be 7.5-point favorites in that game when the time comes, maybe even higher. At Pittsburgh's what I call a variable game. The Steelers' pass rush has dominated Cincinnati in the past, but they've also shot out. Last year's Kenny Pickett's best game came against the Bengals. So variable game, a bit like Vikings-Packers when Aaron Rodgers was a Packer. Could go either way. And obviously the Week 17 matchup in Kansas City, they don't always have high-scoring totals. In fact, in recent years, they've been more, below 50 points. But obviously the potential there is enormous.
Let's talk about some little more gray area situations. Tell me about something that you're currently considering with Justin Herbert for the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, I like Herbert. We've talked about this a number of times. Since Mike Williams went out in week 3, the offense hasn't had the ceiling it had with Williams. They still need a downfield threat. We talked about it all offseason, Josh. Maybe next year they'll finally get the guy a lid lifter. But, week 15 and 16, I'm cool with Herbert. I have him on a 7-1 team that's pretty stacked up. But in week 17, if I can get CJ Stroud against the Titans, I'm gonna grab him and hold him for as long as I can, just so I have the option to pivot if I want. Because, one, Broncos defense is playing very well right now. And 2, late, and this, Josh, late year games in Denver can also come. I'm not really afraid of cold weather, but wind is something that bothers me. And if wind starts getting over 25 miles an hour, I want something to pivot with Justin Herbert. And I'd ideally pick Stroud.
Folks, all of my boots on the ground. I live in Denver. I will keep the good people updated on the weather for week 17. Let's talk about Dak Prescott. back-to-back massive games, at least 25 fantasy points. Looks like the Cowboys offense is starting to put it together. His playoff schedule is at Buffalo, at Miami, and then Detroit.
Yeah. I think Joe Burrow's the line right now. Maybe we'll get Trevor Lawrence in that top group too before the playoffs, before we get closer to the playoffs. But and we talk about this a lot, Josh. I'm not a big straight up streamer because I know in my leagues right now there's like 6 quarterbacks in a home league that are on the waiver wire, and you don't really want any of them. So what I prefer to do instead is like say I have Dak Prescott, who's my baseline guy, where I then stream in certain matchups with him. Things are going well right now, but he's had a volatile couple years now. So with Dak Prescott, I want to pair him with Brock Purdy, who has the Cardinals in Week 15 in Arizona, the Ravens on Monday Night Football in Week 16, and at the Commanders in Week 17, just so I have the option to go with a team that has a premium offense as well in case Dak's struggling down the stretch.
Yeah, I definitely am very excited about Purdy Week 17 at the Commanders. Commanders have already been a defense that we've been targeting this season. And now that they lost 2 of their starters on the defensive line, Chase Young, Montez Sweat, I could see the 49ers putting up 6 touchdowns in that matchup. One more that I'll mention is I really like Russell Wilson for Week 17, home against the Chargers. I grabbed him in a couple leagues this week, actually. He's on bye. I was able to get him for $1. No one else is bidding on Russ at this point. Chargers allow the most fantasy points a game to quarterbacks, the most passing yards per game to quarterbacks, and Russ has quietly had a 16-4 touchdown interception ratio. His quarterback rating's 102. He's actually played just fine. He's lacked actual pass volume and pass yardage, but the efficiency metrics have been there, and I think there's paths where you look up and go, wow, Russell Wilson just got me 26 fantasy points for Week 17.
One of the things that I include in this schedule look ahead is, if you're in the FFPC main event, you can't trade. But for most people in home leagues, you can. So, Josh, I wanted you to handle trades because, you have your trade calculator, you have your rest of season rankings, you're more zeroed in and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to ask. I went through your targets and avoids here. I'm going to ask you about a couple of these guys if you don't mind.
I don't
First
mind.
up, excellent. First up, you have Jonathan Taylor in there, which I love. What are you thinking about with Jonathan Taylor down the stretch?
So before we talk about the schedule, Jonathan Taylor outsnapped Zach Moss nearly 2-1 this past week. Taylor's been more efficient on the ground than Zach Moss in back-to-back weeks now. I know that was a concern. We were like, oh, wow, Zach Moss looks pretty good. He's pretty efficient. Well, that has flipped. Kind of what we expected to happen at some point is that Zach Moss, not the type of running back that's going to be consistently efficient. He is not the elite pure runner like Taylor. Taylor's been running twice as many routes now per game. And then if we look at the schedule, home versus Pittsburgh, on the road versus the Falcons, and then home versus the Raiders. The Steelers have given up the 4th most rushing yards at the 9th highest yards per carry to running backs. Overall, that's a top 10 fantasy matchup. We like that in Week 15. Week 16 at the Falcons, I'm actually not excited about that. You're not benching Jonathan Taylor, but you're hoping for 14, 15 fantasy points. And then we get the Raiders. We'll just keep piling on them all episode. Already giving up the 3rd most rushing yards per game, 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs. Just fired their head coach. I believe they fired their GM as well. And then they benched Jimmy Garoppolo for Aiden O'Connell. We'll see who's starting at quarterback then, but this looks like a demolition spot where you can get the Jonathan Taylor 200 yards and 3 touchdowns game in Week 17.
I'm with you on that. They fired their offensive coordinator too. I think the day after they fired the coach from GM. So things are a little crazy in Vegas right now. Speaking of crazy, Josh, Arthur Smith cannot be relied upon in any way, shape, or form, but that's opened a window for a guy like Bijan Robinson that you generally have to pay high for. What are you thinking about BJ Robinson right now as a trade target?
So one thing I love is that when you try to trade for Bijan Robinson, cite his fantasy points per game. Let people know he's only averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game. It's because of the headache game. You take out the headache game, he's at nearly 16 fantasy points. That sounds a lot different. So I'd first lead with the fantasy points per game. And then what you can think about is his playoff schedule. At Carolina, home versus the Colts, and then at the Bears. All we're looking at is the 2nd, then the 5th, then the 7th best matchup for fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. Rookies often peak later in the season. And with Bijan Robinson, with the Falcons sneakily in the playoff picture, they may lean on their most talented offensive weapon in those matchups.
I'm a Hollywood Brown guy, Josh. I've loved him since he was in Oklahoma. You've been talking about him for weeks. He's a guy you want to target. Tell us about Hollywood now.
Week 15, they face the Niners, and that's actually not bad. The Niners have quietly allowed the fourth most fantasy points per game to receivers. Then week 16 at Chicago. Chicago has a weaker pass rush, and that's going to portend pretty good things for a deep threat like Hollywood Brown. Then week 17 at the Eagles. The Eagles allow the most fantasy points per game to receivers. We've talked for a few weeks now about how they've sort of become a defense to target for quarterbacks and receivers, where this is looking like one of the most extreme pass funnel defenses in the NFL.
You definitely can't run on them, Josh, so you have to throw on them.
Yeah.
Nico Collins is a really good schedule stretch down week 15 through 17. Just really glad to see him on your list here. What are you thinking with him?
So he has a unique schedule. Actually, all Texans and Titans players do, because it's the one matchup you get twice. So week 15, he's at Tennessee. Week 16, home versus the Browns. And then week 17, they host Tennessee. So it's Tennessee, Cleveland, Tennessee. Cleveland, I don't think we need to talk about that too much. We don't like that matchup. But fortunately, we get Tennessee twice. One of the league's worst secondaries. They've already traded their safety, Kevin Byard, away. And if you're getting a top 7 matchup twice, we're going to like that. It's also just a general pass funnel defense where Titans have been good against the run, bad against the pass. One thing we know is that Dameon Pierce, Devin Singletary, neither has done all that much for fantasy, for real life this year. So really shaping up where CJ Stroud closes out his rookie year with a bang and throws for 300 in week 15 and 17. And hopefully 100 of those yards go to Collins.
That's why I love Stroud in week 17 at home against the Titans. I think the ceiling is exactly that: 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. Now, Josh, we gotta come up with a few guys that you want to trade away too. The first guy that caught my eye here is James Conner. What are you thinking with him?
Yeah, so James Conner starting to build a little momentum. Kyler Murray's coming back. James Conner should return in the next couple weeks. Playoff schedule, pretty tough. Week 15 against the Niners. We talked about how we kind of like the Niners for receivers. That's already been a tough matchup for running backs to begin with. Now they just added Chase Young from the Commanders. I don't even want to think about James Conner trying to run against that front. Then week 16, the Bears are actually, I don't think that's a great matchup for James Conner specifically. So while the Bears have allowed a lot of fantasy points, you might say, Josh, you just recommended them for Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson is an elite pass catching back. He's averaging over 5 targets per game when he doesn't have a headache. On the other hand, James Conner, he has some receiving workload, not all that much. Bears have allowed the second fewest, 3.3 yards per carry to running backs this year. And they have just added Montez Sweat from the Commanders. And then week 17, they get the Eagles. Eagles, best matchup for receivers, and they're actually truly the worst matchup for running backs. Fewest fantasy points per game allowed to the position this year. James Conner does not look like a player I want for the fantasy playoffs.
So follow-up question here, because he's not active right now. So your plan is, when he comes back, let him play a week or two, get a production spike, and then try to ship him off?
Yeah, the second that he has 15 to 20 fantasy points or scores a touchdown, James Conner, goodbye, off my roster.
Next up, everyone on Washington's offense you're interested in trading. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we're just gonna fire sale the Commanders. Sam Howell's looked awesome. This is probably gonna be the best game of his career this past week, when he drops back 55 times against the Eagles. He only takes 1 sack. He throws for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. But then we look at the playoff schedule. So they go on the road to face the Rams at SoFi Stadium. That's fine. Fine. But week 16 at the Jets. Week 17 versus the 49ers. I think the Jets and 49ers pass rushes could ruin the sack-prone Sam Howell.
Yeah.
And just the Jets in general are allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to receivers. The Niners, as we just talked about, have bolstered the already strong defensive line. I think those are games where you could see the Commanders scoring 10 points in week 16 and week 17. So McLaurin, Brian Robinson, Jahan Dotson, who's surged recently. These are all players that I'm trying to get rid of right now.
Another guy, Josh, Tony Pollard. You were below consensus on him entering the season. You've been right to this point. If you have him, you suggest that you should trade him. What are you thinking with Pollard down the stretch?
So the biggest thing for me is week 17 against Detroit. So already Tony Pollard's avoiding tackles at 1/3 the rate that he did last year. He's getting over 19 touches per game. He's never reached 15 touches per game in any season before. So if you're getting a higher workload and not missing tackles, your injury risk goes way up to begin with. We hope he'll be healthy for the fantasy playoffs, but Detroit week 17, when all the money is on the line, they're allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, just 15 fantasy points per game total to running back rooms. Second lowest, only the Eagles are a worse matchup. And I just don't really want to bet on a guy where the pass game is really getting going for the Cowboys. And I think that's ultimately what they'll lean on in matchups like the Lions.
That's Jay Larky tweets. Garrett Wilson, Josh. Poor Garrett Wilson. We know why you want to ship him out of town here, but why don't you tell us just so we're absolutely certain.
So weeks 15 and 16, it might be painful not having Garrett Wilson. He'll probably be entering fantasy lineups because he's facing the Dolphins and the Commanders. My issue is that if I have Garrett Wilson on my team, I am benching him in week 17, facing the Browns in Cleveland, probably a weather game on Thursday Night Football. We already hate these Thursday night games to begin with. Then the fact that it's in Cleveland to a team allowing the third fewest fantasy points per game to wideouts. If there was a quarterback that would be affected by bad weather, it would be someone like Zach Wilson. It's already Zach Wilson to begin with. So if you do not want to have the headache of Garrett Wilson, who you can't play in week 17, I'd try to trade him away right now.
That's a great call, Josh. I mean, the New York Jets could legitimately be shut out in week 17 by the Cleveland Browns. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, I think that game total, if I had to guess right now, it'd be 35, 36 points. If it was 31, 32 with bad weather, that would not shock me either. Let's pivot back, Ryan. Let's talk about some defenses. How are you going to be treating some of these premium defenses in fantasy football?
This is actually why I started writing this column in the first place, because I look at defenses differently than most people. I'm not going to take a defense in the 7th round, but in a high stakes league, I'll take one in the 13th or 14th round over a guy like Devin Singletary. And this is the reason why. 49ers and Eagles. 49ers schedule, Josh, at Arizona versus Baltimore at Washington. Smash spots in week 15 and 17. Eagles at Seattle versus Giants versus Arizona. Smash spots in week 16 or 17. The Cowboys and the Ravens are similarly tiered defenses for fantasy football and in real life, but the Cowboys at Buffalo, at Miami versus Detroit. I hate the Detroit game because of the Lions' offensive line. And with the Bills and Dolphins, you're hoping for a shootout where you get some sacks and turnovers. But the downside is 0 points, where maybe you even lose some in some formats if Dallas gives up 30 or so. And with the Ravens at Jacksonville, at San Francisco versus Miami, same story. I'd rather have the 49ers against the Cardinals or the Commanders in week 17. And this is the way I look at this too, Josh. If you're facing someone in week 17 in your championship, you don't want to see the Eagles versus the Cardinals on your opponent's roster, and you don't want to see the 49ers or the Commanders. So if I'm in that kind of situation where I actually have Dallas on that Justin Herbert team, I'm going to try to swap them for the 49ers or Eagles over the next couple of weeks.
I was looking at the schedules. Correct me if I'm wrong. Browns, do they have at this point the premier schedule for the fantasy playoffs? Chicago, Houston, and then hosting the Jets on Thursday night.
Yeah, I love that one too. I mean, the Bears they're a little better with Justin Fields, but again, that's one with 5 sacks, 2 or 3 interceptions on the table. At Houston, they're going to have a trench advantage against the rookie quarterback. And like we mentioned, Josh, the game against the Jets, especially if it's not a weather game. If it's a weather game, it's going to be very run heavy on both sides, probably close. But if it's not a weather game, that, shutouts on the table, defensive touchdowns are on the table, half a dozen sacks are on the table. So yeah, the Browns, I'm with you all the way there, man. And don't we have the Browns in one of our mid-stakes teams?
Yeah, the Browns were on waivers in the league that we do, the two of us with Nick Bodiford, and we picked them up. We were all very, very excited to pick them up earlier in the season. I don't know why someone dropped them. It's 10-man benches. You'd think you could have a spot on your bench for the Browns defense. Apparently not. Thank you to whoever did that. All right, let's talk about a few streaming options. Week 15, you like the Dolphins against the Jets.
Yeah, again, betting against Zach Wilson. And one of the things, we talk about this all the time. I know in most of my leagues, the streaming options are pretty thin. but Miami's been struggling a little bit. So if I'm 7-1 and if I have a core defense that has a week 15 matchup, I actually want the Dolphins defense against the Jets.
Lions have been one of the best defenses in the NFL this year in a lot of metrics, and they're probably going to get dropped by a lot of teams this week. They are on bye. You like them against Denver in week 15.
Yeah, a lot of things can change between now and then with the Broncos offense. Russell Wilson was a borderline Hall of Fame quarterback 2 years ago. So there's at least some chance of that returning. But right now, Denver still has a very volatile offense that I'd be comfortable betting against.
Week 16, you really like the Seahawks. They travel to face the Titans. Why the Seahawks?
Well, the Seahawks have an excellent secondary, good linebacker group. Their pass rush is kind of more of a middle of the road group, but against the Titans below average offensive line, we're talking, bottom 5 group. Probably against a rookie quarterback unless they pivot back to Ryan Tannehill, which I think we both agree would be strange. Seattle's going to be in the hunt. They might even be in the hunt for the division still. So motivated team, talented defense, want them against a volatile offense.
And then Bengals should be available on waivers pretty much everywhere. Week 16, they face the Steelers.
Yeah, just a bet against Kenny Pickett. The Bengals will probably actually be available in your league too, so we want to be cognizant of that. Some leagues will have better options, but with other leagues, when you're pretty thin, I think Cincinnati has pretty good upside in Week 16 against the Steelers.
You talked about how you like C.J. Stroud Week 17. You also just like the Texans defense facing the Titans for Week 17.
Yeah, I think Houston has exceeded expectations both as a passing offense and their defense to this point in the year, Josh. And we just talked about it with the Seahawks. Titans below average offensive line, bottom 5 group. If they're out of it, motivation could be an issue. And we're also getting Will Levis. Well, there'll be film out on him. D'Amico Ryans will have a good game plan. I like the Texans in that spot.
I actually remember us this offseason. We were talking about some hot takes, and we talked about how the Texans might actually have a top 10 defense this year. And so far, pretty good defense. And then lastly, why wouldn't we want the Jaguars in Week 17 against Bryce Young's Panthers?
Yeah, I recently bet on Josh Allen at 100 to 1 odds for Defensive Player of the Year just because I think that's an egregious line for him. But they have 2 blue chip pass rushers, Jacksonville. The Panthers offense has been non-functional. I expect them to get better, but Jaguars are going to be a contending team, probably going to play with the lead. I like that contest a lot.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. I just love the way that he talks about football. He's watched every snap of every game since 2014. He lives to talk about it. He's got his power rankings up on the 33rd team site on Tuesdays. And today, Thursday, his expert picks and predictions for every game hit the site. Make sure you're checking that out. Make sure that you read through more in depth the ultimate guide to winning your fantasy football playoffs. That is something that the two of us co-authored. That is Ryan's baby that he's been working on for years. Couldn't recommend that enough. And if you're enjoying this episode in general, well, there's a lot more in there for you. Now, let's turn to your record predictions because you dropped record predictions for all 32 teams on the 33rdteam.com yesterday. You were a busy man. I have my rest of season fantasy rankings and trade value chart. Those hit the site yesterday as well. It's a good day for the people. A lot of content out there. I decided to pick 5 teams where your record prediction, I don't know if I'd say surprised is the right word, but where I thought it was at least interesting, possibly surprising, possibly controversial. Let's dive right in. The Seattle Seahawks right now, today, November 2nd, are a half game ahead of the 49ers in the division. But when I looked at your record predictions, you have the 49ers overtaking them. You have the Niners winning 12 games. Talk me through this switch where the Niners usurp Seahawks in the standings.
So the 49ers are on a 3-game skid right now, and I get it. But the truth is everyone in the NFL loses football games aside from the Dolphins, and I think 72 and the Patriots in 07. Those are the only 2 teams that didn't lose a game in the regular season. So not too worried about the 49ers. Their schedule for Seattle, 2 things with Seattle. First, actually, is Geno Smith's been pretty turnover heavy lately. He's been inconsistent. The ceiling's interesting for this Seahawks team. Their defense is good. Their skill group's great, but I don't think that Geno Smith's a bankable guy at this point. I think he's a volatile quarterback with a good ceiling. And then there's this, Josh, at Baltimore, at the 49ers versus the 49ers on Thursday, at Dallas, at the 49ers versus Philly versus the Steelers. That's a lot of good opponents they have there. a handful of elite opponents. So I could see the Seahawks getting the 6 losses pretty easily, where the 49ers, they've played in the NFC Championship in 3 of the last 4 years, have probably the best roster in the league. I'd rather bet on them.
One thing that I was very excited to see is that you have my Los Angeles Chargers squeaking into the playoffs at 9-8 after starting the season 2-4, now 3-4. We talked a couple weeks ago about the loss of Mike Williams, how that hurt this offense, how maybe this just isn't one of the top 5 passing attacks in the NFL anymore. But you have some things changing. How do things change for these next 10 games?
I think the first 6 seeds and it just depends on order, but you're talking about the Bills, the Dolphins, the Bengals, the Ravens, the Jaguars, and the Chiefs. They're all getting it, barring some kind of catastrophic injury. The 7 seed, I think, is going to boil down to the Chargers, the Steelers, and the Browns. I think the Jets fall off because of Zach Wilson. With Cleveland, they have to beat with their defense. They have no offense right now. The Steelers are kind of in the same boat. Kenny Pickett's offense is better than Cleveland's offense right now, but, still a little, we can't count on them. The Chargers are the one team in that group where Justin Herbert can go win a game against anyone. They've lost a number of close games, too. They lost the Dolphins by 2 on opening day. They lost the Titans in overtime. They lost to Dallas by 3. They're better than their record suggests.
All right, folks, buckle up if you are a Packers bandwagon fan or if you live in Green Bay, because you have Green Bay going 3-7 the rest of the way. You have them finishing with an abysmal record of 5-12, 5 wins for the Packers. Do you think Jordan Love starts for Green Bay in 2024? Or do you see them selecting a quarterback early in this upcoming draft?
I think they're going to be in no man's land where they're not going to be quite bad enough to get May or Williams in this draft. So I think they're going to roll with Love again. But here's the thing, Josh. I lived in Minnesota years ago, so I lived around Packers fans for a few years. And I felt like a crazy person at times saying to them, like, listen, your roster stinks. Aaron Rodgers is just one of the best quarterbacks ever. He covers everything up. These wide receivers like Jordy Nelson, if you put Jordy Nelson on a team with a bad quarterback, no one knows who Jordy Nelson is. That's not to say that he's not a good football player, but Aaron Rodgers made a lot of people a lot of money, and he's not there anymore. It's not going to be the same situation with Jordan Love. So they have a few good young pieces on offense, but this is not a very good football team. And I'm with Joe Banner on this. I've never thought Matt LaFleur was some kind of offensive genius. I just thought he had Aaron Rodgers.
Now, the Ravens right now, today, have 2 more wins than the Bengals, but you have the Bengals finishing atop the AFC North with 12 wins. What's the optimism here for the Bengals and Joe Burrow?
This is a good question, Josh. I'm glad you asked this one because I think this is actually this is one of the things that I spent the most time on. First, Joe Burrow's back. Bengals have played in the AFC Championship 2 years in a row. Reliable. We can count on them as long as Burrow's himself. The big reason here, though, is Josh's, again, the Ravens' schedule versus Seattle, versus Cleveland, versus the Bengals on Thursday night, at the Chargers on Sunday night, where the Chargers are going to be more in need of a win than Baltimore, most likely. The Rams aren't a cakewalk. At the Jaguars on Sunday night, at the 49ers on Monday night, versus the Dolphins and versus the Steelers. There's not a single easy game on that schedule for Baltimore. And if we're being honest, Josh, and we've talked about this off air, I think we've mentioned this once. If you looked at Lamar Jackson's passing production every week, and you ask someone if Josh Allen had those numbers, the media cycle would be, what's wrong with Josh Allen? Lamar Jackson's a dynamic athlete, a great player, but he is not a guy who shreds people through the air with any regularity. This is his 6th season, so if he's going to do that, he's going to have to be an entirely different guy. And again, man, that's a murderer's row schedule where Baltimore is good enough where they're going to be 12-5, I think, but I think the Bengals have an edge in that area.
I'm also going to play doctor for a second. Lamar Jackson has missed the final month of the season each of the past 2 years. So this is assuming full health from Lamar. And at this point, I'm not quite sure we can even fully assume that. And then lastly, this was to me the most surprising one. You have the Jaguars finishing number 1 seed in the AFC.
Me and my guy Daniel Raz, before the season, we both saw this. I think we bet on them at 12-1, maybe 14-1. It's been months, so I don't remember exactly. This is schedule related entirely, Josh. I actually think the Jaguars are the 5th or 6th best team in the AFC. When all said and done. When they get off their bye, their toughest game's the 49ers. Then they have the Titans, the Texans in Houston. They play the Bengals on Monday night, which is tough. Cleveland, Baltimore, Tampa Bay, Carolina, Tennessee to close out the schedule. Of all the AFC contenders, The Jaguars have the easiest schedule, the clearest path to winning their own division. So I think it's just a matter of they play easier teams than everyone else, and they have, maybe they don't get it done because they're not the Chiefs, they're not the Bengals, they're not the Ravens, so on and so forth. But I do think they have a good chance to win 13 games.
That's Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. Make sure you check out all his work on the33rdteam.com. Tuesday, he had power rankings. Wednesday, he had his record predictions. And then today, Thursday, he has his picks and predictions for every game. The busiest man in the industry. Saturday, he'll let you know what he's betting on in each game. We'll actually be back on the airwaves later today. Another collaborative podcast with Player Profiler discussing rookie running backs. So if you're listening to this live, check us out in a couple hours for that. Or actually, check us out in 1 hour for that.
Yeah.
We are busy gentlemen. And then check us out tomorrow for the Player Prop Happy Hour with our data scientist, Ben Wolby. Ryan, I'm not going to reveal your Super Bowl prediction. Everyone out there needs to read the read the Ultimate Guide to the Fantasy Playoffs to get more quarterback, defense thoughts, trade targets, and they need to read your record predictions to find your Super Bowl prediction. But let's zoom back to this week. We're focused on week 9. Give me a bold prediction for this week.
I sneakily think that Raiders versus Giants this week is one of the most important games on the schedule because I think the loser ends up with the first overall pick. With the Raiders, I get it. Josh McDaniels, so on and so forth, mess of an organization. I'm not sure how that benefits them in the short term. I'm not sure how firing Josh McDaniels fixes Devontae Adams being wide open on 2 routes against the Lions and Jimmy Garoppolo just missing him. I'm not sure how that fixes that. Aiden O'Connell, when he played the Chargers, and you saw this, Josh, pressure management's the silent killer for quarterbacks in the NFL. If that's who he is, he's not an NFL quarterback, so he has to be an entirely different guy. And then this week, too, I think with the Giants getting Daniel Jones back, I think the Giants are actually going to beat the Raiders. I think they're going to go in there and steal a win, probably have their best offensive game of the year, at least since the second half against Arizona. So I think the Raiders are going to end up with the first overall pick this year.